Hi, thanks for joining me today. It's Geraldine from the Paper Puffin Studio, and today I'm going to show you how to make this fall-themed front flap card. You can see that when you open up the flap, there's another sentiment on the inside, and then you open up the card, and I also have an image on the inside. This is one version that I made, and here's an additional one that I made, a slightly different sentiment on the inside, a sentiment again, and so on. So I hope you like this video. If you do, please remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Now let's get started. Let's begin by reviewing all of the pieces that you're going to need to build the card. So for the base color, you're going to need a piece of cardstock that's 8.5 inches by 5.5 inches. And we're going to be scoring that at 4.25 inches. You'll need 2 pieces of your accent cardstock, and each of those are going to be 5 3/8 of an inch by 4 1/8 inches. You'll need a piece of white cardstock that you're going to use for the embossing, and this piece is 5 1/4 inches by 4 inches. And then for the inside, what you're going to stamp on, you're going to need a piece of your base color that measures 5 1/4 inches by 4 inches. To review how I'm going to make the flap and the leaves, I've got here all of the stitched nested labels dies, just so I can show you the sizes that I'm using for this card. So in this set you have all of these pieces. This is the largest, second largest, and so on. I'm using the third largest and the fourth largest dies. So I'm going to be using these to make the flap. You'll see here I've got a piece of my accent color cut, and that's the scrap piece that is 5.5 inches by 2 3/4 inches. And that will allow me to cut out the flap, and also using this little die from the Wonderful Floral Framelits dies, I'm going to cut out some leaves. These 2 pieces here, which are my base color, are also scraps, cut large enough so that I can use this die and cut out a piece from this and a piece from this. I also have some pieces of scrap that I'm going to use to cut out the additional leaf colors for the front of the card. Here are some of the other items I'm going to need to make the card. So I need this embossing folder. It's the Woodland embossing folder. I'm going to be using crumb cake, tuxedo black, some of this linen trim, as well as enamel dots. I'm taking my largest piece of paper, my base color, which was cut at 8.5 by 5.5 inches, and I'm going to score that right down the center at 4 1/4. I'll fold and burnish that. Here you can see the pieces that I've die cut, and I'm going to be trimming these little leaves off and placing those on the front. At this point I'm ready to start with the embossing. So I've got a piece of scrap paper laid down to protect my surface, and I've got my Woodland embossing folder. I've got my white piece of cardstock ready to go, my crumb cake ink opened, and a sponge. Now I'm going to make sure that when I am inking up this embossing folder, that I've got the Sizzix over here in the front corner. I'm going to open up the folder, and I'm going to turn it so I can manage this a little bit easier. So the Sizzix is right here now, and the embossing folder is open. I'm going to ink up the sponge, and I'm going to be putting the ink on in this direction. And you're not going to worry about it drying before you can get to embossing, because that's not going to be a problem. So I'm going to go ahead and I ink up this surface, and remember it's just this surface of your embossing folder that you're inking. When you're happy with the amount of ink that you have on your embossing folder, you're going to turn it again in this direction. I'm going to take my piece of white cardstock, and instead of placing it directly on here, I'm going to be placing it on this side. just so I can figure out exactly where I want this to go. Once I'm happy with the placement of it, then I'm ready to close this up. And you'll see that this is how it's going to appear on the front. I'm going to run this now through my embossing cutting machine and pick up there. Now that I've run the embossing folder with the paper through the cutting machine, you can see what ends up happening. So I get more of a defined image of the trees, and so now it's got a little bit more dimension to it. Now this piece is going to get attached to the accent color that we cut, and then this will get attached to the front of the card. Now just to review so that you're clear, I've got my card here. I've got my accent color, which I'm going to be attaching with some snail here. And then I'm going to, using some snail, I'm going to attach this to the front. We're going to pick up there. Also, just to let you know, when you're cleaning your embossing folder, you just need to run it under some lukewarm water and let it sit to dry. Now that I've got the front of the card assembled here, I'm going to start with making the flap. So taking this piece which we used earlier and die cut, we're going to line it up so that the point here on the right hand side is lined up with the number 1, just barely touching it. At that point then, I'm going to score. Then I'm going to fold, and I'll have my little piece like this for the flap. Now to assemble the flap, after I've folded this piece in, this is going to end up sitting in behind these two pieces which will be attached to each other. Before I do that, I'm going to stamp an image right here. Just makes it easier for me to do it in that order. I have the image of the tree stamped for the inside of the card, and this piece is attached to the accent color. But before I attach this to the inside part of the card, I have to decide where exactly I want this flap to go. The flap is going to get glue here, and it's going to get attached like so. But before I do that, I just want to have a look at the front of the card just to see exactly where I want the flap to sit. So I'm pretty happy with it about right here. So I'm going to go ahead and put some glue on the flap right here. I'll attach this onto this piece of cardstock and then attach it to the card. We'll pick up there. So I've got the flap attached to the inside piece for the card. You can see back here. So now I'm going to put some glue on this portion and attach it to the inside of the card. So now that this has been all attached, I'm ready to decorate the flap. So I'm going to be using these two pieces which we cut earlier, and I'm going to be stamping some sentiments on here. I then will trim them to fit on the front and on the inside. And when I trim them, I'm going to use this piece from the stitched nested labels so that when I trim the piece, it's going to have the same stitching that it has all the way around. Now to go through how I'm going to do this trimming portion, I'm going to line up this piece of cardstock with the flap and decide exactly where I want to place this die cut. So I make a little pencil mark and decide that that's where I want it to be placed. I'll run this through the die cutting machine, and I'll do the same with the other piece. You can see here that I ran this piece through the die cutting machine to get this stitched edge here. Now I'm going to just trim off this edge piece, and I'll do that for both pieces. I chose these sentiments and stamped those on these pieces. One will get attached here, and then the other will get attached on the inside here. I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'm ready to start decorating the front of the card. Now that I have the sentiments attached to the flap, I'm going to start cutting out all of these little leaves and then attaching them to wherever I would like them to be on the front of the card. So I went ahead and I detached all of the leaves from the little stems, and I've placed them about where I would like them to go on the card. You can see some of them will get covered up by the flap, and this one here, because it's kind of peeking out, I'll adjust that one a little bit because I don't want a portion of it to be peeking out from underneath. I'll go ahead and using the Tombow glue, I'll attach all the leaves to the places where I want them to be. So you can see I have all of the leaves placed where I would like them. Some are in behind the flap, which is nice because they peek out when you open the flap. I've placed a little enamel dot here and a bow of the braided linen trim, which I attached with a glue dot. I'm now going to use the Wink of Stella, and I'm going to put some sparkle in all of these little indentations along all of the trees. So here's the finished card. It's a little hard to see where the Wink of Stella is. I'm not sure if it can even be picked up in the camera, but it does add a nice little bit of sparkle to the card. So when you open up the card, you see the other sentiment on the inside, and then to the inside the tree, and you can write a note for the recipient. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.